Well, welcome everyone. We are here to uh, join this wonderful presentation, Plant for the Queens. Before we get started, I wanted to offer just a little insight into Zoom and how we're going to be working together today. If you take your cursor and move it down to the lower part of your screen, you'll see a toolbar pop up. You'll see something called Q&A. That's the feature we're using today for people to submit questions for our panelists. We have disabled chat, so that's not a feature, and encourage everyone to use the Q&A. My name is Jean Stets-Pachelski from the Easton Pollinator Pathway, and welcome everyone today. I'm going to pass this over to our host, Mary Ellen LeMay from Aspetuck Land Trust. Welcome, Mary Ellen.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Jean. Thanks for signing in, everybody. This is a very exciting opportunity for us to continue our Native Pairings lecture for the Aspetuck Land Trust. And before I introduce our speakers, I just wanted to thank everyone for coming and give you a brief overview of the Aspetuck Land Trust and the Green Corridor Initiative and why our talk today is such an important factor in improving biodiversity. So the Aspetuck Land Trust is a 4-town land trust. We preserved close to 2,000 acres in a 4-town area and have 44 nature preserves. But we can't protect all the land, so we also encourage land stewardship. And in this area called the Green Corridor, we've developed 40,000 acres that includes protected land and your backyards. And we're trying to improve biodiversity in that corridor by encouraging homeowners to create stepping stones of healthy landscapes in their backyards to allow for the flow across the land for wildlife, for birds, and for our pollinators. The goal to improve biodiversity. So there are 3 simple things that we're telling homeowners to do in their backyards. 1 is plant natives, 2 is rethink your lawn, and 3 is avoid pesticide and herbicide use. And these are the 3 critical points that entomologist Doug Tallamy said are important for biodiversity. So we are following his lead on that. And our speakers today will focus on the first one, which is plant natives, specifically planting in the spring for flowers that are plants that are early blooming for our queens that are coming out of the ground right now. If you'd like more information on the Aspetuck Land Trust Green Corridor, you can see the link at the bottom. We've got a great website and information that you can print out on the Green Corridor. So I'd like to introduce our speakers today for Plant for the Queens. Our first speaker is Emily May. Emily is a pollinator conservation specialist with the Xerces Society pesticide program. She received a Master's of Science in Entomology from Michigan State University and has studied pollinator habitat restoration, bee nesting habits, and the effects of pest management practices on wild bee communities. And a special thank you to Emily as well, because the Xerces Society is sponsoring our Zoom webinar for today. And our second speaker is Jim Sirch. Jim is an education coordinator at the Yale Peabody Museum of Natural History. Previously, he was a science teacher in Vermont and education director of the Connecticut Audubon Center in Fairfield. Jim was also an adjunct professor of biology at Sacred Heart University and has taught courses in wildlife ecology for more than 10 years. He received a Master's in Environmental Studies Administration from Antioch, New England Graduate School. So I'm very happy to have our 2 speakers today, and forgot to mention why we call this lecture series Native Pairings. The goal is to bring in 2 local or native experts in a particular area that can help us to get people to change their landscape habits and transform their properties. And both Emily and Jim are natives and local experts that we have joined with us today. So I'm very excited to have them here. So I will, without further ado, pass this on to Emily to begin her lecture. Thank you.
Thanks, Mel, for that. And let me just share my screen real quick. And so can you see my slides?
We can see them. Yep.
Oops.
Beautiful.
Yep. Okay, wonderful. So hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name's Emily May. I'm a pollinator conservation specialist with the pesticide program at Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. Thanks to Aspetuck Land Trust for organizing this event. So I'm excited to talk with you today about planting for the queens, or really talking to you more largely about bumblebee conservation. We're going to cover a bit of broader pollinator ecology and then dive into bumblebees more specifically. So we're going to talk through the bumblebee life cycle and how we can support these essential pollinators with native plants. So we had originally planned this webinar to be focused mainly on the Northeast US because Aspetuck and Jim and I are all based in Connecticut. But once we posted the event on the Xerces website, our audience did expand a bit geographically, and we do appreciate all of you tuning in. So I would say the specific plants that Jim will be talking about are most relevant probably for the Northeast, but the general concepts of bumblebee conservation should be relevant anywhere that you might be listening in from. Before I did get started, I wanted to mention that Xerces bumblebee experts Rich Hatfield and Katie Lamke are holding an in-depth webinar on bumblebee conservation tomorrow, which is going to have a little bit more of a Pacific Northwest focus. So if you're interested in learning more, especially if you're out west, I would highly recommend signing up for that. So today will be a bit of a teaser for the information that they are also covering tomorrow. All right, so I'll get started with the ecology and then turn it over to Jim to talk more specifically about plants. And please feel free to type questions into the Q&A and we'll look forward to answering those at the end. So if you haven't heard about Xerces, we've been around since 1971 working to protect wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitat. We're named for the Xerces blue butterfly, which is believed to be the first American butterfly to go extinct from human development. It lived in the coastal sand dunes around San Francisco. And we do a variety of on-the-ground conservation work with programs in pollinators and agricultural biodiversity, endangered species, pesticides, and we have a new community engagement program focused more on urban communities. Our work is supported by Xerces Society members, so thank you to those of you out there who have supported us through your membership. We really appreciate it. So let's get started. I think if you've tuned into this program, you're already aware that pollinators, or animals that move pollen from the male part of a flower to the female part of the flower in order for those plants to set seeds and produce fruits, pollinators are essential for our ecosystems and for our diets. Pollinators are incredibly important for natural systems. They allow wild flowering plants to reproduce and continue reseeding in their environments. And those seeds and fruits that those flowering plants produce are also food sources for many other kinds of wildlife, from birds to mammals and us. Through that simple act of moving pollen from flower to flower, pollinators help build out the base of the food chain for many different species. And pollinators themselves are actually part of that food base. About 9 in 10 bird species will eat insects at some point in their lives. And larval butterflies, or caterpillars, are an incredibly important source of protein for many different birds, especially when they're feeding their young. So who are the pollinators responsible for this incredibly important service? There are many different kinds of animals that visit flowers, usually looking for nectar and its sugar source, and then end up pollinating those plants. So that's everybody from butterflies and flies to beetles, hummingbirds, other vertebrate pollinators. But chief among all pollinators are bees. Bees are our most important pollinators, and we have an incredible diversity of native bees in the United States. Just here in Connecticut, we have about 350 species of bees, and there are more than 10 times that number of species across the whole country. And they range in size from big carpenter bees that get in your sheds to really tiny bees that are less than the size of your fingernail. Many of them don't look like what you might picture when you think about a bee, like that metallic green sweat bee in the bottom right of this picture. So why are bees so important for pollination. It's partly because, unlike a lot of the animals on that last slide, bees are actually actively collecting pollen and transporting it back to their nests to feed their developing young. So they have all kinds of specialized body features for collecting pollen, and they're really efficient at it. So if you look at the bee up on the top left, that's a small sweat bee with pollen that's packed in dry, all in and around the top of her hind legs. The bee right underneath that on the far left is a leafcutter bee, which is called a leafcutter bee because it cuts out little sections of leaf to make little walls in its nest and paper its nest. And leafcutter bees collect their pollen underneath their abdomen on these specialized hairs. So they're able to sort of belly flop onto these open flowers and collect tons of pollen at once very efficiently. Another reason bees are our chief pollinators is they're just a very efficient. Once they've learned to collect pollen on a particular kind of flower, they'll keep going back to that same kind of flower because it's more efficient from their perspective to do so. So that ends up being important for pollination because they're just bringing in pollen from the same species of plant. So I could go on and on about lots of different kinds of bees, but we're really here to talk about bumblebees. So I'll keep moving. But I first did want to quickly talk about honeybees, which are the bee that pops into people's heads when we start talking about bees. And the European honeybee is a unique species. It was brought to America by ship with European colonists. And it's unique in a number of ways. It is social, so most native bees, not including bumblebees, but most native bees are solitary, meaning they are as a single female going out and doing all the work. With honeybees and bumblebees, you have a queen who lays eggs and produces offspring that then help out in the colony, taking care of all the different tasks like foraging for nectar and pollen and taking care of young. So social bees have this cooperative care system, which is somewhat unique among all bee species. Honeybees have multiple generations a year. They also are perennial. So they're one of the only bees that overwinters above the ground, and they're overwintering by feeding on their honey stores. But they're still active and could go out in January, for example, if it warmed up. And their colonies, they've been domesticated over many centuries. So their colonies are now managed for crop pollination and can be trucked around the country and moved in and out of crop fields. But very unlike many other bee species. So most of those more than 3,600 species of native bees in the US are quite different from honeybees. The vast majority, about 2/3 of native bees, live underground with only these tiny holes to give any sign that they're there. The other third lives above ground in tunnels, in old snags and old pithy plant stems. So on the right there is a Seratina bee, which is a small carpenter bee, in a blueberry cane. That's her nest. And then bumblebees represent about maybe 1% living in cavities. So about 1% of native bees live in small cavities in the ground, which could be above or below ground, but are commonly old rodent holes. And we'll talk more about nesting habitats for bumblebees in just a bit. Of those ground nesting bees, so 70% of native bees nest underground. And those holes are really inconspicuous. They can look a lot like ant nests. They might not look like anything to you unless you're looking really closely. And a lot of times they're found in sort of bare and exposed ground in sandy soils. This is what they look like if you go down from that inconspicuous hole into the ground. The female will dig down and then form these little holes where she'll build a pollen ball and then lay an egg on top of it. Depending on the species, these ground nests could be anywhere from a couple centimeters down to over a meter. So some of them are excavating very far down for protection. And a lot of bees are lining their nests with waxy secretions that help resist moisture and flooding. So once they're that far down, especially if they're in a wetter soil, it's helpful to have some protection from that soil moisture. So before I talk about the life cycle of a bumblebee, I figured I should talk about the life cycle of a solitary bee just for context. So this is a mining bee, an andrena. and a female would emerge probably sometime, in late spring. She would come out of the ground and start collecting pollen and nectar, excavating her hole in the ground, and building these cells and filling each cell with a ball of pollen and nectar, laying an egg on top of it, which then develops through the season, through the summer, into a pupa, and then would overwinter in the ground as a pupa and then emerge the next year. So it's an annual life cycle where the female is only active for a few weeks of the year, doing all of the work, and then her pupa and her offspring would live underground for the winter and then start the cycle over again the next year. So then stem nesting bees, which are the other 30% approximately of native bee species, are living above ground in stems or tunnels, often in things bored out by beetles. Some can chew cavities with their jaws like carpenter bees, but many are dependent on those beetles for nest cavities. So dead wood and wood-boring insects, two things we often want to get rid of in our yards, are actually really important for these bees. Plants with pithy stems like sumac, blackberry, or elderberry are also really important nesting sites for a lot of these species. And many of them make little nest walls. So mason bees and leafcutter bees make nest walls made of mud or leaves, sometimes even flower petals. And what that looks like, so in the bottom right here is a reed that has a mason bee nest. And the mason bee has come in from the front of that tunnel and gone to the back, made a little nest partition with some mud, and then made a cell with that pollen and nectar ball, laid an egg on top of it, gone out and collected more mud, and then made another cell, and so on and so forth until the whole tunnel is filled up with her offspring. The cool thing about these bees is that they can choose whether they're laying a male or a female. So in these mason bee nests that have a single, entrance hole, the females are often laid first, where they're most protected, and then the males are laid towards the entrance hole, where they'll emerge first and also provide some protection in case the nest gets invaded by some kind of parasitoid. So these bees have a lot of interesting behaviors, but it can take many, many flower visits just to supply one pollen ball. Even over 1,000 flower visits for one pollen ball, one offspring. All right, so that was ground nesting bees, stem nesting bees, and here we are at cavity nesting bees, which are the bees we're here to talk to you about today, bumblebees. There are 47 species of bumblebees across North America. They are, like honeybees, social, so they're founded by a single queen, but then have offspring that develop and come out that same year to help out with a lot of the tasks in the colony. Unlike honeybees, though, they last only one season. So the queen is an annual queen and not perennial. She will last for the time from early spring when she emerges through sort of late summer as she is laying the last of the males and the new queens, and then she dies and the new queens fly off to start their own nests. A full nest in midsummer might contain somewhere from 25 to over 500 workers. So it sort of depends on the species and how good a start they got at the beginning of the year, but they can be pretty variable in size. And bumblebees are total overachievers at pollination. They are some of our best pollinators. They pollinate many, many different kinds of plants, and they are highly efficient at collecting pollen. If you look at them, they're just covered in hair. They're very strong flyers also. So research from California almonds found that in windy conditions, honeybees, which are not the strongest flyers, tended to move into the center of blooming trees where they are protected from the wind. But bumblebees, which are strong flyers, carried on pollinating the outsides of those almond trees during windy conditions. So having both types of bees in the orchards, but especially bumblebees and mason bees, both of which are strong flyers, provided better pollination to those trees than honeybees alone. Bumblebees are also capable of buzz pollination, which is a behavior that honeybees, for whatever reason, don't exhibit at all. So bees that can buzz pollinate can basically vibrate their flight muscles at a high frequency, like a high C on a tuning fork. And that causes pollen to shake out of flowers like salt from a salt shaker. So some flowers benefit very dramatically from buzz pollination, like tomatoes and blueberries that store their pollen up inside their anthers where it needs to be shaken out. And some other wild plants like senna or shooting stars and pitcher plants also benefit from this buzz pollination behavior. So bumblebees, sweat bees, and some other groups of wild bees, but not honeybees, are the only pollinators that have that behavior. I don't know if any of you on this have heard about the latitudinal species gradient, but there tends to be more biodiversity as you move towards the equator for most species groups of birds and other animals. Bumblebees are one of the only species groups that are actually more diverse in northern or mountainous regions. The Northwest US is a particular biodiversity hotspot for bumblebees, but we also have quite a few bumblebees up here in the Northeast. Here in Connecticut, I want to say 17 or 18 different species. So let's talk about the life cycle of these bumblebees. And thinking more about the timing of all of these different steps in their life cycle can help us understand how best to support these pollinators throughout their lives. So right about this time of year, we have queens that are coming out of the ground, looking for a nest site, and then starting to found the colony. So going out, collecting pollen and nectar, building out wax cells, filling them with some pollen and honey stores, and laying eggs. In early summer, the first set of workers will start coming out of those cells and to help grow the colony through the summer into its peak. So the queen at that point will stop going out for pollen and nectar and will just focus on reproduction. So through the summer colony peak, you'll start to see smaller worker bees of bumblebee species out collecting pollen and nectar, bringing it back to the colony, building it up to that peak of 25 to over 500 workers. And then in late summer, the queen will switch over to producing males and then new queen females, which are much larger than worker bees. And in early fall, males and then the new queens will leave to find mates. After mating, males die. That's really their only purpose. They don't have any nest functions. They just leave, sip on a lot of nectar, mate, and then die. The mated queens in fall will build up fat stores by sipping on a lot of nectar, eating some pollen, and then they will seek out overwintering sites. And at that point, the original queen from the colony dies, and the new queens overwinter in the ground. So this is a picture from early spring of a queen emerging from her new nest hole that she has established. So nests are established by these overwintered mated queens in the spring. The queens spend about 2 or 3 weeks at the beginning of the season looking for the best possible nest site. And sometimes competition for these sites can be pretty intense, and you'll see bees kind of facing off, because what they're looking for is a nest that has pre-existing insulation. So something like a rodent hole with some fur from the old rodents that were in there. A lot of them will seek out compost piles because of the innate warmth of the material breaking down. Sometimes they're looking for sites that have really good sun exposure and have a good temperature inside. So it could be a bird's nest in a tree stump, or it could be a rodent hole in the ground. This is what some of those look like. This is a bit of a compost mulch pile on the left that had a bumblebee nest in it. Some straw mulch can a lot of bumblebees will also sort of burrow in straw mulch or under these bunch grasses that form tussocks and have a lot of dried straw that can become part of their nest insulation. And then this is what a bumblebee nest inside an old rodent hole looks like. It's a bit messy. So inside the nest, if you think about a honeybee colony, they're in these very neat frames. Honeybees are kind of neat freaks, and they keep everything very organized. Bumblebees are extremely chaotic inside their nests. So on the right there is what a full colony looks like. And all of those different little cells have different things in them. So the open ones have bumblebee honey. So bumblebees do actually produce honey, but it's stored in a way that we really can't access it, nor would we really want to, because it's mixed in a lot of times with their poop and other things. It's not as neat as honeybee colonies keep it. The closed off cells are where they are producing offspring in that picture on the right. So inside the nest, you'll get these cells of eggs where the queen has laid multiple eggs together on pollen cakes. Those eggs develop into larvae, which are tended to by the queen and workers, and they'll feed on those pollen cakes. And then pupa will get their individual cells. So pupa are colorless. That's the transformation between a larva and an adult. And they look like kind of strange alien white pre-bees, which is just what they are. And then they'll eventually emerge from those cells with all the hair and looking like a bee. So very messy, chaotic nests, but they're very fun to look at close up. So that's what it's through the summer that all of that is happening. In the fall, new queens and males are produced. A lot of colonies don't actually make it all the way to reproductive stage, sometimes because of predators or kleptoparasite bees that take over the nest and lay their own eggs in it, or other types of parasites. So a lot of colonies die off pretty early on. So males are unfertilized eggs. Like I said before with mason bees, these are haplodiploid. So the queen is fertilized, and she can choose to lay fertilized or unfertilized eggs. The fertilized eggs are female, and the unfertilized eggs are male. So these males have no nest duty, and their only responsibility is to go out and find mates. This is another beautiful graphic showing the full life cycle, starting with that early spring queen, founding the initial nest, building up the colony over the summer, and then new queens and males leaving the nest and mating, and those mated queens finding a suitable site for overwintering. So those mated queens in late summer, early fall are foraging to build up their energy reserves, fat stores, and then they overwinter in short burrows called hibernacula, which are, they can be in lots of different sites, and we're still learning about what sites they prefer, but they could be under leaf litter, on northern sloping areas, under trees, in rotted wood, in areas of bare ground. I once saw an overwintering hibernaculum site with tons and tons of Bombus impatiens, our eastern common bumblebee, that was sort of in this warm area behind a house. And we just pulled up sod in this woman's backyard, and there were dozens of overwintering bumblebees just under the grass. So why did I talk through all of that ecology? It's because it helps us understand how we can provide habitat that will support those bumblebees throughout their life cycle. So that biology can inform habitat design. The three things that bees and other pollinators need for habitat is food, so nectar and pollen, and particular host plants. In the case of, for example, many butterflies and moths have very specific host plant requirements. They need shelter, so nesting in those overwintering sites. And then they need protection and refuge, so protection from pesticides as well as disturbance like tillage. So let's talk a little bit about how plant diversity improves bee nutrition. So nectar that plants provide is the main source of sugars and then secondary plant compounds for bees. Those secondary plant compounds are any number of things, but we're learning more about how bees will actually seek out plants with particular secondary plant compounds that help them with immune defense against various things they're encountering. So sometimes it might help them actually fight off a pathogen infection, for example, by feeding on a plant with particular secondary plant compounds. Pollen is the main source of proteins and lipids for bees. Protein concentration of pollen is important for larval development and adult reproduction in all different kinds of bees. And then lipids are also crucial for a variety of physiological processes like egg production and wax production, and can contribute to sort of overall individual health. So This is a new slide for me in my presentations, and I'm kind of excited to talk about it because I just find some of this research on bee nutrition super fascinating. So plant pollens can vary in protein content. Some plants provide pollen that's very high protein concentration or very high lipid content, or vice versa. Some don't supply very much at all. What's amazing is that researchers are finding that in different landscapes, bumblebee colonies will seek out and collect approximately the same ratio of proteins to lipids in their total pollen collection for the nest. And I want to say it's somewhere like 10 to 1 or 12 to 1 proteins to lipids. So it's helpful to have a diversity of plants available that provide different levels of those macronutrients to make that process easy for bees. So even in wildly different landscapes with plants providing different kinds of protein concentrations or lipid concentrations, they're seeking out an overall mix that has the same protein to lipid ratio. Bumblebees are also scheduling their days to visit the best resources first. So if you want to know what plants in your yard are really preferred pollen and nectar sources, I'd highly recommend getting up early, grabbing a coffee, and sitting outside to observe your plants. So bumblebees are simultaneously regulating intake of sugars, proteins, and lipids in ways that we're really only beginning to understand. All right, so why are we talking about planting for the queens? This is a graphic from a publication I did a few years ago looking at different bee flight periods. In relation, this publication was about blueberry bloom, so early spring crop bloom. And you have bees that have very short life cycles, like mason bees and mining bees that are only active for a few weeks at a time. And then you have honeybees that can be moved in and out for crop pollination. They're obviously active all the way through the season if you're keeping bees. This was a graphic that was focused specifically on sort of crop and farm production. So in this case, honeybees were being rented. But then you have these social bees or semi-social bees, like bumblebees and sweat bees, that are active throughout the season. There's a lot of research on what is the most important factor for colony growth and offspring production. This is from some work looking at season-long flower abundance, and which found that seasonal consistency of resources, so flowers that provide pollen and nectar, was important for both the number of queens produced by bumblebee colonies and the number of workers and males that those colonies produced. So colony growth and offspring production, bumblebees, really depends on the availability of pollen and nectar. And this is really just straightforward. You could probably figure this out for yourself. I figured I'd throw some graphs up so that it looked important. And we're here to talk to you about critical periods. So one of the main critical periods for bumblebees is early spring. This is a vulnerable period for emerging queens that are out looking for nests. This early pollen diet, the early resources that a queen can access, drives colony growth through the rest of the season. So the quantity and quality of pollen collected at this time is an important driver of how well those bumblebees do. If they make it to reproductive period, a good start can help them win the race. Early spring is also vulnerable just because of variability in weather conditions at that time of year, particularly in a changing climate. So shifts in climate could lead to mismatches between when bumblebees emerge and when the plants that support them start blooming. So in warm springs, bumblebees might emerge days before plants start flowering, and snow melts early and soils warm up more quickly than ambient temperatures. A review of museum collections found that over the past century or so, the phenology of 10 different bee species in the Northeast US has advanced by an average of 10 days. So what's the answer? We can't really solve climate change on our own, but we can help build resilience in our local environments. Planting a diversity of species that bloom in early spring can help build that resilience into the system. So having a lot of different things, one of which that might be blooming at the right time for bumblebee coming out is what I mean by resilience. Woody species like maples and willows are good early forage. Spring ephemerals, like this Dutchman's breeches, are preferred resources for queen bumblebees. One of the best places to look for queens in the early spring is in wooded areas with rich soils that have these spring ephemerals. Before that tree canopy closes up, there's still a good amount of light that reaches forest floors, and you'll find bumblebees in there foraging and seeking out nest sites. And I know this is about early spring, but I also want to mention that a critical period for mated queens is early fall to mid to late fall, because the overwintering success of those mated queens depends on their energy stores and fat stores. So diverse fall forage that blooms as late into the season as possible helps those new queens build up their reserves to actually make it through the winter to the early spring of the following year. So I'm coming to the end of my time here. I did just want to say a couple things and then talk about one community science project that we've been running. But by taking steps to support bumblebees throughout the growing season, providing them with continuous blooming forage from early spring to late fall, we're supporting many other species, because pollinator habitat is also habitat for many other kinds of wildlife. So by building out the base of the food chain, we support all the levels of plant communities and animal communities that depend on pollinators, and has ripple effects that improve the functioning of our landscapes for other wildlife. If you need more ideas, I would highly recommend that you observe plants in your communities. Like I said, pull out a chair, bring out a coffee, look at the plants in your backyard, see what's being visited the most often. One of my favorite things to do on dog walks is just to see what resources are being used in my neighbors' yards so that I can go back and plant that same thing in my own yard. I would recommend you check out our resources on our Xerces page and explore community science projects and other ways to get involved. One of which is Bumblebee Watch. So this is my boss, Mace Vaughn, based in Portland. One of our community science efforts is Bumblebee Watch, which is a collaborative community science project between several conservation organizations and university researchers. And Bumblebee Watch is a way that you can contribute to monitoring of bumblebee populations and their conservation status across the US and Canada. Having lots of people equipped with cameras taking photos across the country helps cover quite a bit more ground than any individual expert might be able to cover on their own. And it has helped us find some remnant populations of rare bumblebees. So how does it work? Bumblebee Watch is pretty simple. You take a photo of a bumblebee. Here's Mace taking a picture of a bumblebee. You log into Bumblebee Watch and you upload your photo. And there are identification guides for North American species, which can help narrow it down and help you make an ID. Once you've submitted your photo and ID, it will be verified by an expert. So this is a good way for you to improve your own identification skills and contribute to research and conservation efforts. If you are commonly out there taking photos on your phone camera or whatever, log into Bumblebee Watch and submit your observations, and maybe it will be something very cool. All right, so I'll end by directing you to our website. Some of the most helpful work we do is putting together detailed science-based guidance for pollinators and other invertebrates. And we have tons of free downloadable national and regional resources on conservation of bumblebees and farming for bees and lots of different things. And you can also find listings of our upcoming events, like tomorrow's Bumblebee Conservation webinar. So with that, I will turn it over to Jim Sirch from Yale Peabody Museum of Natural History, who will talk to us more about conservation plantings for bumblebees.
Thanks, Emily. All right. I'm going to get started here. All right. Well, I wanted to just mention we're not talking today about the person on the left side, Queen Elizabeth, but as you can gather by now, we're really talking about plants that we could plant for queen bumblebees and early arriving other solitary bees as well. And so Emily mentioned a few species, and I'll be adding to that list that she did mention. First, I'd just like to say that the Yale Peabody Museum of Natural History, we're part of Yale University, and where I work what we do is advance the understanding of the planet's history through geological, biological, and anthropological research, and communicating that research. And that's what we're doing today. So that's our main mission, is to really see about what our collections and how they're so important today in the changing world that we live in. So we didn't really focus so far. Emily mentioned a few, and just touched upon the fact that many of our species are declining. So you've heard probably through a lot of press and media that, about the insect apocalypse. Well, many of our species are declining, and in part due to habitat loss, climate change, as we mentioned, and also many of the pesticides and herbicides we're using now in our yards, which actually is more than all of agriculture, people's yards. So this is a chart that I got from Tracy Zarilla, who's a bee biologist at the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station, and showing 16 species that are in Connecticut. And this goes back to around 2013. So some of these species are probably more declining than they used to be, or that are more declining than what is shown in this chart. And
Jim, I think you might need to share your screen. Sorry to cut in.
Whoops, sorry. Okay.
While Jim is doing that, I wanted to let everybody know the question and answer session will be after Jim's presentation. So thank you for all the questions that are pouring in. So as Jim shares his screen there, just know we appreciate the questions and we will get to them shortly. Thank you.
Sorry about that, folks. Okay, here we go. Okay. How are we now?
We're good, thanks.
Yeah. Everybody see full screen? Okay, good. All right. Just move on very quickly. I mentioned about the Peabody Museum and the fact we're very communicating research about our planet's natural history. And but here's the chart I was mentioning, and I apologize for that. So there's 16 species, and many are declining, unfortunately, and but there's much we can do to help with that. Bombus affinis, the fourth listing down, is the rusty patch bumblebee with listing, and hasn't been seen since 1997 here in the state. Declining, actually, is probably not in our state anymore. So it's actually it's not present, hasn't been seen for a while. So and that is also a federal listed endangered species. So due to the various reasons we talked about, we have an issue with many with pesticides and habitat loss, a variety of things that are causing issues today for our pollinators. I went out just the other day and took this picture of an emerging, it looks like Bombus impatiens, or a common eastern bumblebee, sitting on a daffodil. Well, it was not taking pollen or nectar from this plant. So that's something to think about, that many of the early flowers that we think that bumblebees might go to, they don't actually. And because many of our daffodils are hybridized, so they actually don't provide much in the way of pollen and nectar. So there may be a few species daffodils that can, but really would like to talk mostly today about our native plants that are so important and that these bumblebee species have evolved with. This is a chart from the Xerces Society, where Emily works. And by the way, you don't need to frantically write down, because we are going to be sending you a list of many of these species that I'll be showing today. But nationwide, there are a few of these plants that are throughout the country, some in both the East and the West. And okay, this is the publication that chart came from, called Conserving Bumblebees, and it will be in our resource list that we'll send you, so not to worry. But a great publication. One of the first plants that is actually in bloom, this is a red maple, Acer rubrum, and we're looking probably at female flowers. The tree actually can produce male and female flowers on the same tree, also on separate trees. They are both wind pollinated, but they also supply pollen for early emerging queens. So this is a really, really important source for queens. And think about plantings in your yard and how much the amount of pollen that you could provide through whether you have small plants or trees and shrubs. I'd really want to emphasize that you plant trees and shrubs, because think about square footage and how much you could supply by planting a tree to these. So they're starting to forage on these quite early. And as you probably know, back in March and April, they're actually going to, they're coming around. The tree's pretty easy to tell apart. It has three-lobed leaves. And right now, I just took this a few days ago, the samaras, the fruits, are bright red. It's a really nice clue. So it's a fantastic tree to have in your space and use. And one of the best shrubs that I could recommend for any of them would be pussy willow, Salix discolor. This slide, you can see probably a couple different pussy willow species. This might be black pussy willow right here, but on the left side of the slide is pussy willow. And what it has is the flowers, close up here, are just loaded with pollen. So they not only serve bumblebees, but also some of the native solitary bees that Emily had mentioned too. So this is a great, great plant. By the way, I just want to, going back to take a look at, you can propagate this actually by just cutting branches off and replanting them quite easily. It's not the most long-lived species. It likes wet soil, but it can withstand, drier soils too, if they're rather rich. So not the most long-lived, but actually quite easy to propagate and continue going. Highly recommended. You'll get even butterflies that are laying their eggs on the leaf as a larval plant. Also, I happened to check out, I had not every, plant that you might have in your yard is a native plant. This is a Korean rhododendron hybrid, I believe, the ones that come out quite early. And I did happen to notice in the one in my yard, it had 3 or 4 queens simultaneously getting nectar and pollen from it. So you don't have to take out everything you have in your yard and totally put in native plants. Some non-native plants do serve well. And this would be one example that would. Further on into the late spring, pinkster flower, our native azalea in Connecticut, is in bloom on the sort of ledge tops, sunny, open areas, can withstand drier areas. And you can identify bumblebees somewhat, but you're not going to be able to see it unless you look closely. But scientists can identify them too by the length of their proboscis, so whether they have a long tongue or medium or short tongue. And so I would imagine the long tongue bumblebees would come and nectar on this plant. Another one of my top 10 shrub and tree lists would be New Jersey tea. So you know this Americanus. This is the one member of this plant family that we have in the East. And a clue to its conditions and what it likes is what you see in the background here below. It looks like dry, rocky, sandy soil that it can withstand, which is nice. It is very slow to get going, so don't give up on it if it doesn't do much the first couple years, because what it's doing is developing a long taproot. So I have it actually not in sandy, rocky soil, but I have it planted in a real warm part to eastern part of my house that gets a lot of sun from off the house. So, and it's a little drier because it's in the rain shadow of the gutter. So, of the eave, I should say. So that's another really, really great plant for early emerging queens and many other pollinators. Just planted a few years ago, this eastern redbud. This is actually taken from my yard, so I apologize. It's not a huge tree, you can't see it. But close up, it has these tubular type, well, it's a pea flower, the member of the pea family. This is redbud, Xerces canadensis. And they, very important queen plant. And notice the tree blooms along the branches, which is really quite neat. A high bush blueberry is, Emily mentioned earlier, blueberry is very, very important crop for people, but also for a lot of our pollinators. This is one of the top 10, I believe. It has great fall foliage. Get rid of your invasive barberry in your area. It's causing so much problems. Get rid of your burning bush. And look at the fall color that this provides. So a great native plant. Very, very adaptable, likes sun, prefers sun, but can still bloom. I have it in part shade and it's blooming fine. And this is just focusing on a few of the butterfly species that will nectar on it. But as Emily mentioned, bumblebees will come and buzz pollinate it. So they're shaking their body around, and that is releasing the pollen. So this plant really does need bumblebees in order to be successful. So there are many plants that are, in a sense, specialists for bumblebees, although I would say that bumblebees are generalists. So we're going to talk about a few specialist solitary bees, but bumblebees go to a variety of sources. Another tree you might have in your yard are crab apples. And so bumblebees are actually going to those as well. So members of the apple family are used by bumblebees, very, very important. This is a crab apple from my yard. As well as there's members of the cherry family. So these are top cherries, willows are top members of the pollinator supergroups that Doug Ptolemy had mentioned in his couple of books, Bringing Nature Home, and the newer one that it has now. So the cherries, this is a native pin cherry. Also there's choke cherry, Prunus virginiana, of course black cherry. So those are be in bloom in a few weeks here. So just a little bit later on. And I believe that queens are out for about 6 weeks, getting provisioning before they really the other members of the colony take over, hatch and take over. So they're, it's really key to provide these early flowering plants. Not shown here is a picture of the flower, but choke berries, not choke cherry, but the aronia is the genus. Here it is in berry. This is black chokeberry. The white flowers are really good pollinator plants for bumblebees as well as many solitary bees. It is quite adaptable. It's now in the health food stores. It's one of these superfoods, that people are buying aronia, medicines and so forth, or vitamins, mixtures. So. All right, well, so we can talk about, those are just a few of the shrubs. There are, and trees, there are many others, but we can also think about some of the plants that you can also put in your yard that can even grow underneath them or nearby. And so what I like about many of the charts that in that guide that I just showed you, Conserving Bumblebees, is that it's a good idea to put a lot of the same plant kind of together, but also to think about throughout the season what you're putting in your yard, and try to have at least 3 different plants in bloom at any one time. And this shows it quite nicely. So again, don't frantically write down. We'll give you a listing of some of these resources. I'm highlighting just a few of them today. And Emily has shown this plant twice. And I'm going to show it a third time because I was out, I took this photo nearby where I live in Southern Connecticut, and just ready to snap a picture of looking for a queen bumblebee, just looking around, and I turned away, and a queen bumblebee came in and pollinated, went to one of the flowers and took off right before I could take the pictures. Like, oh, just missed her. But anyway, Dutchman's breeches, a great plant. I would highly, advise not to gather these native plants from the wild, but they are in the nursery trade. Just when you go to a nursery, please ask that they have been nursery raised and propagated before, rather than dig them from the wild, because they really need our help out in the wild. Not as many as there used to be, but they are in the garden trades. You can get them, at different nurseries. Another one is bloodroot. So this is another herbaceous plant coming into flower for just a few days in early spring, and bumblebees are coming to them as well as other native bees. These are what are called spring ephemerals, and it's interesting that they have the seeds of these plants. Both these plants have this fatty it's called an elaiosome, and ants gather the seeds, bring them into the burrow, eat that little fatty area right in here off it, and then put the seed into a dump pile, which is then raised, or which then actually can sprout and grow. So not only they depend on bumblebees and other bees to pollinate them, but they depend on ants to plant them. And they go through a cycle where they'll need a couple years. So if you were to gather seeds, put them in I gather a lot of wildflowers, I put them in a white plastic milk jug, I take the top off and poke holes in the bottom and cut the middle and then plant or mix in there. You can actually hold them over, but these are two-stage germinators. So what you'll need to do for these is put them in the spring. They have to go through a cold period, another warm period, and then the next following spring, they will then germinate. You can also save time and just put them in a little baggie with damp vermiculite and so forth too. So there are plants that actually bumblebees will come to that are not native to Connecticut or this area. But so again, it's not that you have to get rid of your plants, but you probably, as a if you garden, probably notice bees on many of these flowers. So it's okay to include them, but try to take away more of your lawn and add native plants. So Jared Thaler from Xerces Society and Sam Droege from USGS Patuxent Center, Wildlife Center, actually put a nice publication which will give you, and looking at many of the native specialist bees. These are the solitary bees, some of which Emily mentioned to you, and they're only coming to certain plants to get the pollen from. Here's a couple. Golden Alexanders at the top there, a member of the parsley or carrot family. This is probably the original plant that black swallowtail butterflies actually came to get pollen from. And bumblebees will come to those. That's going to be in bloom, right? It's in bloom right about now here in Connecticut. And another one later on in the summer is New York ironweed. So these are specialists. These plants there are bees that only come to these plants. One species might only come to this plant to get pollen, a solitary bee, as well as the bumblebees. But without it, you're not going to have these smaller solitary bees. I'm not going to go into this too much. Emily's mentioned that about 75% of our bees are ground nesting. Here's this giant example is only about 1/4 of an inch. This is a mining bee, Andrina, as mentioned. And many of these solitary bees, as well as bumblebees, are coming to another plant would be wild geranium that is now in bloom in southern Connecticut, and a great one to plant in your yard, in your space as well. One of the top plants, I would say, for any of our pollinators, including bumblebees, would be our mountain mints. And here's one native Connecticut example, narrowleaf mountain mint, Pycnanthemum tenuifolium. There's actually 2 other species in the state as well. And not only is this a great pollinator plant, but if you put it around the edges of your borders, deer don't like to step in it because it's very fragrant. It's in the mint family. So there's a little bit of deer control that you could maybe keep them away from some of the other plants that you might have in your border. This is wild bergamot and Monarda fistulosa. So besides this swallowtail butterfly, it's a great plant for bumblebees a little bit later on in the summer. So we're getting into some of the other plants that are at other times of the year. Later on in the season, you'll also have woodland aster, Aster divaricatus here in Connecticut. And again, those of you out west seek some of the native asters that you could put in your yard. Our asters, goldenrods are, I would say, the top pollen plants that you could ever, imagine to have in your space. This one I have I've grown from seed in that little milk jug idea that I mentioned to you. So don't shy away from any of our native shrubs as well. This is sweet pepper bush complete with a bumblebee, Clethra onophalia. There's a lot of varieties of Clethra. And, this brings up the point of nativars versus straight species. In general, most of our plants, most of our native wildlife, our pollinators, have evolved with the straight species. So in many cases, they have higher amounts of pollen and nectar than, say, more of our, cultivars or hybrids and so forth. Not always, but in many cases. So you might try to go with as much as possible with the straight species. The other part of that is that many insects will come and eat the leaves. So they have co-evolved with these plants to feed on the leaves. So think about your yards, your gardens as places for insects to eat the leaves of. That's a new concept. So that's something that I'd highly recommend as well. I wanted to show a couple of native plants that actually really depend on bumblebees. And white turtlehead, Chelone glabra is one of those. So bumblebees will force their way through open up the front part of the petals to get inside and get to the nectar and pollen and come out. So without bumblebees, this plant probably would not exist. Another species is bottle gentian. This is Gentiana andrewsii. And if you've ever seen a bumblebee forcing their way in, this is another one of those where I just didn't have the camera quick enough to catch that. But it's a great thing to see this plant being pollinated by bumblebees. So these are late summer herbaceous plants, wildflowers you can put in your garden. Towards the end of the season, and Emily alluded to this, is that it's real important to have, plants that are in flower when bumblebee queens, the new bumblebee queens are getting ready to go into hibernation. They need a lot of resources to get through, fatten up, and also, to get through that time. And our goldenrods are really great for that. So, and also asters like New England aster would be another great plant. So don't forget to do that and have that in your yard. By the way, I think most people know this, but our goldenrods, you cannot get an allergy from. It doesn't make you sneeze. The pollen's very heavy. It falls to the ground. It doesn't float around in light. It's usually ragweeds that are growing next to this plant that cause problems for people. And by the way, this is a native goldenrod to Connecticut, blue stem goldenrod. I really like it because it grows in dry shade. So many of our goldenrods need a sunny meadow, but here's one that doesn't. So just a couple of different groups to think about for bumblebees, but also some of those specialist solitary bees are willows, blueberries, members of the sunflower family, Monarda, the bee balms, goldenrods, and asters. Don't forget, too, that I think Emily mentioned this as well, that in nesting sites and places to hibernate for the queens in the wintertime, leave some logs in your yard or rocks. A messy place in your yard is actually a good place for wildlife. So any of your neighbors complain about how messy your yard looks, you could just say, well, I'm really helping pollinators by doing that. So you have an excuse to be a little messy. Also, that our native bunch grasses, warm season grasses, such as little bluestem or Panicum virgatum, the switchgrass, those are two that are really great. Bumblebees will actually use those as hibernacums. They'll burrow down in the center of these grasses and can sleep down below, and occasionally nest in those places as well. So a couple of, just to summarize here, try to have about 3 species in bloom at a time. Group your species, particularly herbaceous plants. If you have trees and shrubs, you don't have to worry about this because you've done that. Leave snags and dead trees as well for our tunnel nesting bees. Create a brush pile, logs, rocks, and leaves. I love Xerces' poster that says, leave the leaves, don't blow them to the, and put them to bags. There's a lot you could do with them, just that many of our insects and pollinators are using those leaves to overwinter and a variety of other things. Get rid of your lawn. Try to reduce or totally not use pesticides. You have a variety of plants, you will actually, that will really help you with getting rid of some, you'll attract some species that will feed on pests. So if you have a variety of native plants, you're going to have a variety of pest-eating other insects that will be helpful, and eat more deer. So, all right, I want to thank just these folks here that have helped out with this program. Thanks. Okay.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Jim. And now we're going to return, and we have just a wonderful set of questions from our attendees. And if you hit your stop sharing screen at the very top, Jim, we can come back live, and
yep,
each of our folks can answer some questions. So Emily, there was a question.
I saw that there were some questions about how to differentiate males, workers, and queens. So
exactly. And here you are.
Can you see my screen, right?
Fantastic. Great.
Okay, so this is not a bee that we have in the Northeast. This is Bombus nevadensis, but it was a nice slide that showed some of the differences in size. So different species are going to be different in terms of color patterns between males, workers, and queens. Sometimes the males have a totally different color pattern, and workers and queens look exactly the same but different sizes. And then you can have different sizes even within, bumblebee workers. But one of the main ways you can tell males, workers, and queens is just timing. So queens are coming out at the beginning of the season, and they're quite big. So that's the main way that I can tell it's a queen, is that if she's active in early spring, and like you really hear the drone or the buzz of the bumblebee moving around flowers heavily, it's probably a queen. Later in the season, so midsummer, that's when you're going to be seeing workers out. So there's a little bit of an overlap period in late spring where you'll have queens and workers of different species active at the same time. But then in midsummer, it's almost all workers out in the field. And then males will be primarily active in late summer, early fall. So timing is one way to know just what's more likely to be out. And then let's digging a little bit deeper. So these are mostly photos from Bee Spotter, which is another observation tool for bumblebee photos. On the right here, you have a picture of the hind leg of a female. So queens and worker bumblebees both have a pollen basket. It's called a carbicula on their back legs. This is where the female will pack pollen mixed with a little bit of nectar into their hind leg. It's kind of like a spoon on the back leg. That's how bumblebees carry their pollen around primarily. Males have a convex hind leg, so they don't have a pollen basket. You won't see pollen hanging off their back legs. So if you see pollen hanging off the back leg of a bumblebee, it's a female. And if you see, something that isn't scooped out at all, it's a male. So you have to be pretty close to be able to spot that. But if you are able to get up close or take a picture, that's how you can tell a female from a male. Over on the left side is sort of a picture. You can see some of the differentiation in size between a queen and workers. So workers can be really variable in size, but they are all going to be smaller than a queen. So a queen is really quite a few millimeters larger than any worker produced by the colony. And then males can be variable, but they're usually about as big as the biggest workers. So I hope that helps. If you're interested, you can go on the Bumblebee Watch website to look at some of the identification guides, which will help you work through some of the color patterns of different species.
Thanks, Emily. We have another question. When we were talking about different types of bees and their nests, the question of can we make artificial nests popped up on the screen.
So there are people that have tried to make artificial bumblebee nests. I've seen some that are like a box that have insulation material inside of them that you bury in the ground. I have not seen very much success with those artificial nests. Now, some people say they've had great success, so you can absolutely try it. But I've heard a lot more success just with compost piles than I have with artificial nests for bumblebees. I will say, I think I saw in the questions, there were questions about artificial nests for other native bees. And there are lots of resources out there about mason bee nesting and leafcutter bee nesting materials. So those are what you would see if you've heard of bee hotels, or if you have a bee hotel in your yard. That's typically for your tunnel nesting, stem nesting bees, and that comes populated with bamboo and reeds and other things. So there's lots of different materials out there. I will say—
Can I mention something?
Yeah, please.
I just wanted to mention too, for mason bee boxes, that it's also a good use of an invasive Phragmites stems. The larger stems of Phragmites make a nice substitution for bamboo stems or some of the stems that you would find in those mason bee boxes. So.
Yeah, I will also say that the bamboo in particular, because it has a very wide entrance hole, tends to be used not at all by bees, but by different kinds of wasps, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. You have grass-carrying wasps and cricket hunters, that kind of thing, that will come in there, and they'll have these little bits of grass poking out from your bamboo. But those tend to be too big to fit any kind of a bee. They like to have a reed that is about exactly the same size as their thorax, so that when they go in the tunnel, maybe it scrapes off some mites and other things from their back. They like to have it just the right size for their body. I think you have to be careful with those types of artificial nesting materials, because they can over time build up, foul brood, chalk brood, pathogens, parasites, all of those things that happen with commercially managed bees, or anything, that's a permanent habitation for a pollinator. So there's resources like How to Manage the Blue Orchard Bee that have information about how you can clean out those materials over time, or replace them over time. And I would suggest, I can include that in the email that goes out, but I would definitely suggest that you look into that, particularly if you have any kind of large scale bee hotel. I think I'll leave it at that.
Yes. Thank you so much. So there were questions about the cold spring and the impact it might have on the bumblebee population and other bee populations.
Yeah, so I saw the same thing this year. It seemed like it was a cold spring and not as many bees were out. It's hard to judge year to year how weather is going to impact bee populations, and typically you don't see the impact until a year later. So we're seeing this year what happened last year, right? And same with last year in terms of how many bees are coming out of the ground in the springtime. I will say in my own research, we do see impacts from year to year of cold springs or really erratic springs where you get an early warm up and then a freeze where blossoms, are frozen off of trees and there's no resources available for bees. So you will see that impact the following year. Or if you get really intense summer droughts where all of the nectar resources and pollen resources dry up in the midsummer, you'll see that impact in bee numbers the following year too. So yeah, we do see impacts of these weather events and general climate conditions from year to year. Bees, if you get a couple of good years in a row, bee populations do tend to rebound too. So it's a bit of a boom and bust cycle for bees from year to year.
So we have another question, a question around flowers, and do they offer multiple feeding or visits to bees? And if so, how many visits?
So that depends. Yeah, that depends on the flower.
It depends on the flower, yeah. And many flowers do. That there are some flowers that will actually add more nectar, particularly, and recharge that. But it just makes, so it's not always the case. So that's why it's really important to have a variety of flowers that are in bloom at different times of the year. Because as I mentioned, bumblebees are generalists, so they'll come to a variety of different flowers.
Great. We also have some people on the call today from the Southeast, and they were curious about the different pussy willows and what might be appropriate for the Southeast region.
So I would actually try to research what native, pussy willow is not the only native willow that are found. There is, I'm not sure if there's a tree called black willow, Salix nigra, I believe, and it's, I believe it gets down into the Southeast. So that's another great plant. So I would try to really check out what plants that are willows that are native to your area. So various shrubs. And that would be one, and particularly, you're not going to, by taking a branch off a willow, you're not going to kill a shrub. So that might be one that if you were to find, and we're very, very careful and had permission, you could take a cutting in early spring of those kinds of plants. So yeah, it really would depend on it. I'm not familiar with what species are in the Southeast, but yeah, it would just take some research and talk to native plant societies, nurseries, and so forth to find those out. Please.
Yeah, so I did see that that question in the chat, and I reached out. I have a colleague based in North Carolina, Nancy Adamson at Xerces, and she doesn't have any Southeast webinars coming up, but she did say that she has some old webinars about Southeast pollinator conservation that can be found on conservationwebinars.org. And we also have resources for Southeast pollinator plants on the Xerces website. I would also recommend checking out the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center website, which also includes plant lists that are host plants for butterflies. So if you're interested in conserving butterfly species, they have some of the best resources on what plants will conserve which butterflies.
And there is actually National Wildlife Federation's Native Plant Finder, and also Plants for Birds, which is National Audubon Society. So two other resources where you can look up specific plants for locations.
Many other questions about visiting the nursery trade and sourcing plants and really being able to navigate that well to support our pollinators, our bees, and other native wildlife. What advice would you give to people on the call today to how to navigate that and have those conversations?
That's a great set of questions. Jim, you go. Yeah, I'll follow up.
All right. So I would, I would, when you're searching through the nurseries in various locations, see what species are listed and whether they are cultivars or not. You can also, apply a little pressure to try to see if they can get sort of the natives and not as much the native or cultivars. The issue is that they've been raised to, some of these flowers to what looks really beautiful for people and might not necessarily be as attractive to pollinators. So, yeah, that's I mean, Emily, anything else you want to mention with that?
Yeah. So I would say that starting by looking for a plant nursery that specializes in native plants. A lot of times they come with a deep well of knowledge too about what's native and what supports pollinators. We have several of those in Connecticut and the Hudson Valley, if you're in this area. Nurseries can be a challenging thing to navigate because a lot of them are using systemic pesticides to treat various types of sucking insects and other plant pests through the process of producing those plants. So finding a nursery that advertises itself as both a native plant specialist and one that manages without systemic pesticides, that's going to be your ideal place to find plants that support pollinators. We are coming out with a variety of resources for navigating the pesticide conversations with nurseries. Those should be out in a matter of only a month or two here from Xerces, because I know that's a question that comes up all the time is how do I have that conversation with my nursery producer? And it's a hard one. So hopefully our resources will help with that conversation.
And if I wanted to add, if you can get sources of local or regional seed, you're actually then growing the straight species. So that's another area.
Right. And stay tuned. There are a lot of projects underway for that. I know Mary Ellen is sitting there so excited about that point. We have a few more questions. We have around a few minutes left here, and we have just a whole variety of questions dealing with some specific plants. So one question might be dandelions. How great a pollen source would dandelions be?
So there's increasing research that dandelions may not be the best source for, they are not native to our area, but they do, I would say dandelions are better than nothing. They do provide some nectar and pollen. But it's not, the best source. So I've noticed, I was out the other day and they were mostly honeybees that I noticed on them, which is interesting, which from where they're from. So I would not think about going out and putting herbicides on your yard to get rid of all your dandelions. Enjoy them. Some pollinators are coming to them, and so that's okay. The other part of this is, the dandelions being found in this, they're just, what was I going to mention? Just an okay source, but there are much others you can use. Anything else, Emily, you mentioned?
Yeah, dandelions, they're really great for honeybees. Honeybees definitely go to them and collect pollen from them. They're missing a couple of key amino acids in their pollen, right. So you can't raise honeybee brood just on straight dandelion pollen, but they're a great addition to the mix. So if you have dandelions, don't take them out of your yard, but also you don't necessarily need to go out and be seeding them into your yard. There's other things I would put into your yard before I put dandelions in. But they are, one of the earliest things that bloom. And I do see, mostly honeybees on them, but I've seen sweat bees and small carpenter bees and bumblebees occasionally also visit dandelions as a pollen source.
And the other thing to mention just very quickly is that the many of our invasive plants, pollinators will come to, right? But the issues about them is that they don't provide a really nutritious source overall for our native pollinators. The other part of it is there aren't insects to feed on the leaves. So our native willows, besides just that being a great pollen source in the spring, there are many species of insects that feed on the leaves. They're larval food plants for great butterflies. There's a lot of species of butterflies that will go to them. So that's something to think about as well.
I'm seeing a couple of questions here about other yard plants. So
exactly.
I see ground ivy and henbit. I wouldn't pull them out. Ground ivy, I think the other one I'm thinking of is purple dead nettle, which looks a lot like ground ivy. And both of those are great nectar sources for bumblebees in the early season. And, you know, purple dead nettle in particular, if you find it becoming an issue, it has such shallow roots that it's very easy to pull out. But it's one of the first things that I see bumblebees going to as a nectar source early in the season. So I wouldn't remove it. I'm also seeing questions about phlox. So phlox, I don't see anything visiting. I've never seen any insect. I have 2 things of phlox in my yard. And forgive me if this is TMI, but I put them in the corners of my yard because that's where dogs pee in my yard. And they look pretty and they can resist it. But they don't really provide any resources as far as I can tell for insects because I've never seen anything on them.
I actually have seen some pollinators on meadow phlox, and we said that the most hybrids and so forth are not, and nativars are not really that great. But there are some studies showing that some of them actually can be better. And that one example, there's one called Phlox Gena, Jeanna, and that actually it has smaller flowers than some of the meadow phloxes that are cultivated and hybridized. So that is one, it might be a nativar, I believe, that does attract pollinators. So
yeah, that was specifically creeping phlox that I've never seen anything on.
The smaller spring phlox, yeah.
Yep. I have seen things on ajuga. So ajuga and henbit, ground ivy, clovers, dandelions, violets, all of those things coexist pretty readily in lawns. So if you do want to keep lawn around, those are some plants, even though some of them are not native, that do provide resources for pollinators.
I think a question came up on garlic chives or garlic mustard. Right? Plants, but that idea of the garlic mustard that we see so readily out there.
So a lot of the alliums, so garlic chives and nodding onions and that kind of thing, bees and other pollinators will visit. Garlic mustard, I would recommend pulling as soon as you have it. Yeah.
One plant can has so much seed, about 5,000 seeds on just so that's one to really get rid of.
The good news is it's gratifying to pull. It comes right out.
It's true. Although it sometimes comes right back from the other seeds that are in that disturbed seed bank, as I found out this year.
5 years worth of work there.
5 years, yeah.
Well, we had a wonderful question. Emily, Jim, are you available for yard and site visits?
So yes and no. Right now, no. Given the COVID situation, I will. I do some site visits in the Northeast, mostly with the USDA. So in partnership with the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service. So if you're an eligible landowner for one of the conservation programs through the NRCS, that's when I would be able to come out and do a site visit. But I can always help, if you have photos of things or questions about management of a particular plant problem, that's something I can help with remotely.
And I would say, I'm working during the week, but it's a possibility at other times. And like Emily, I can certainly answer questions. Yeah.
And that contact information will be provided. So thank you for the question, everyone. Mary Ellen, we're getting close to the end of the hour. So if you unmute yourself, how shall we end this?
So this was such an incredible lecture. I'm just so thrilled to have our wonderful speakers here. And I did see a question about, is this recorded, and its availability of our other 2 native pairing lectures, because this is number 3. So this has been recorded. It will be available on the Aspetuck Land Trust website. I'm sure the Xerces Society will also have it, and potentially Yale Peabody. But it definitely has been recorded. We can let folks know just to continue to look at our sites and see if you can find it. The other 2 native pairing programs, which we did in conjunction with our fabulous partners at Earth Place in Westport, which is an environmental learning center. They were done late last year, and then early this year they were done live, and they were not recorded. However, our plan is to redo one of them as a Zoom, and it's going to be simple steps for a healthy lawn and garden. And it's going to really be a focus on lawns and rethinking your lawns, not only what you put on your lawns, but reducing the size and maybe mixing in clovers and creating a pollinator lawn in some cases. So we will be redoing that one. But this has been such a great success that, you know, I'm liking the opportunity to have these recorded and stored on websites. So thank you for participating. And I really, really appreciate the master facilitator, Jean Stetz-Pachalski, who did just a beautiful job in managing this program. So look on our websites for a recorded version of this. Also, Jim, you mentioned that we would have some of the items available for people to, through Xerces and Yale Peabody, to print out some of these sheets. So with that, I thank everyone for coming. I encourage you to go to the Aspetuck Land Trust website and Xerces Society and Yale Peabody and collect as much information. And I wish you all a very happy and healthy and safe spring and enjoy planting for the Queens. So thank you very much for coming today.
Thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.